A girl fell in love with her male teacher, but in the end, he cruelly murdered her and turned her into a human chair. As the investigation deepened, the reason behind it all was even more shocking. The story begins in a classroom. Kobayashi wakes up from unconsciousness. He finds a bloody saw in his hand, and his teacher has already been brutally dismembered. His body turned into a grotesque human chair. The police soon arrive and seal off the scene. With the murder weapon in hand, Kobayashi naturally becomes a suspect, but Officer Kagami doesn't jump to conclusions. There's still a possibility that someone is framing Kobayashi. After a preliminary interrogation, Kobayashi is released, and during that time, the under 14-year-old Kobayashi remains unusually calm. This makes Officer Kagami very curious. Back in the classroom, Kobayashi begins to recall what happened the day before the incident. He received a text message from the teacher asking to meet, but when he arrived, the teacher was already lying unconscious on the floor. Then, someone hit Kobayashi from behind and knocked him out. When he woke up again, it was already the next morning, and the teacher had been brutally dismembered. Clearly, the killer had planned this ahead of time to frame him, and it was likely someone familiar to both him and the teacher. But what exactly was the motive behind it? Later, Kobayashi and Hashiba visit the office of the genius detective Akechi. Kobayashi wants to become Akechi's assistant, because this case deeply fascinates him. Before this, Kobayashi had never shown interest in anything. It wasn't until this morning when his teacher was murdered and he was framed, that he felt a kind of satisfaction he had never experienced before. Akechi agrees to take him in, but only if Kobayashi solves this case by himself. Akechi then reveals something shocking. Their teacher was actually a serial killer, and the police have now issued a warrant for Kobayashi's arrest. At that moment, a group of officers arrive at the office. They had found a murder weapon at the teacher's home with Kobayashi's fingerprints on it. It turns out that their teacher was not only a victim, but also a murderer who dismembered the teenage girl and made a chair out of human flesh. And so, Kobayashi is arrested by the police, but before he leaves, he whispers something to his friend Hashiba. The next day, the new teacher, Hanabishi, was conducting a class when she suddenly noticed a phone at one of the desks. At that moment, someone in the class becomes visibly terrified. The observant Hashiba notices it, and immediately reports it to the police, just as Kobayashi predicted. The real killer is in the classroom. Kobayashi begins his deduction. The day before the incident, the teacher sent him a text asking to meet, and Kobayashi had long known that the teacher had feelings for him. The meeting was meant as a confession of love. The killer must have known this too. That's why he killed the teacher and framed Kobayashi. This means that the murderer was a close person who had access to the teacher's phone. The teacher had killed many girls in his home. No matter how skillful he was, he couldn't have left zero traces. Kobayashi's guess is this: all the victims were in love with the teacher and voluntarily let him kill them. This was a twisted, pathological desire to be loved and noticed. By becoming chairs, they could stay with the teacher forever. Kobayashi concludes that the killer must be the teacher's lover. Only a lover would be able to access the teacher's phone and know about the plan to meet Kobayashi. That person couldn't bear the teacher's affection for Kobayashi, so she dismembered the teacher and turned him into a human chair, then framed Kobayashi. As for who that person is, Kobayashi already has the answer. Remember that phone Miss Hanabishi found in the desk? It was a trap Kobayashi had planted on purpose to lure out the real killer, because the killer would definitely try to retrieve that phone to protect their identity. With this, the whole truth comes to light. The killer is their classmate, Hoshino, and her motive is exactly what Kobayashi had deduced. It was all because of the teacher's change of heart. Ever since she was abandoned by the teacher, Hoshino hated Kobayashi, hated him for stealing everything from her. But then she says something that shocks everyone in the room. Since the teacher no longer loved her, he wouldn't turn her into a chair or apologize, but she wanted to be turned into a human chair by him. Hoshino kneels and confesses her crime. Thus, the case finally comes to an end, but Kobayashi makes one last request. He wants to inspect the chair the teacher used to sit on. He believes someone as twisted as the teacher would hide something important nearby. And sure enough, after cutting open the leather, a horrifying skeleton is revealed. The beautiful teacher suddenly appeared to take a look. And so, Miss Hanabishi takes a 6-month leave of absence. One last thing to note: Kobayashi is a boy. This perverted fatty is so sick. Simply because a girl refused to call him daddy, he ground her alive and mixed her in cement to make a wall. A few hours earlier, the famous detective Akechi received a request to investigate a missing girl. According to the police, the prime suspect was a man named Kageo. Kageo was a mysterious phantom thief known for disguises and transformations. He always wears a paper bag over his head, so no one has ever seen his real face. Akechi thought the case was too simple, so he passed it on to his assistant, Kobayashi. But unexpectedly, Kageo came to Kobayashi on his own. It turns out he wasn't the culprit. On the contrary, he had also been investigating the real perpetrator. He approached Kobayashi to propose a partnership, because the girl he once swore to protect with his life had recently gone missing as well. Her name was Yuko. She had helped Kageo during the lowest point of his life. Yuko was sweet and sensible, but she had inherited a disease from her mother, so she was bedridden most of the time, and her father left her because he couldn't afford the high cost of surgery. Since then, Kageo would disguise himself as a patient or a nurse, just to visit Yuko and chat with her. Despite all her suffering, Yuko always wore a bright smile. One day, a mysterious donor gave her a large sum of money. It gave Yuko the chance to have surgery. After recovering, she specifically sought out Kageo to thank him. She had always known it was Kageo who stayed by her side. It was also Kageo who raised the money for her surgery. Kageo was surprised that his disguise had been uncovered and, before parting ways, gave Yuko a necklace and promised to always silently watch over her. But then Yuko suddenly disappeared. That's why Kageo came to Kobayashi for help. His plan was to have Kobayashi dress up as a girl to lure out the kidnapper. Kobayashi agreed. That night, he put on his disguise and went to a place the kidnapper was known to frequent. Sure enough, not long after, he was knocked unconscious and taken away. When he woke up, he was locked inside a room. Besides Kobayashi, there were 4 other girls who had been kidnapped, but they were so terrified they didn't even have the courage to run. Soon after, Kageo tracked Kobayashi to the location, but there was still no sign of Yuko. At that moment, one of the girls pointed to the next room. Kageo rushed in and pulled down a curtain, but all he saw were 5 human-shaped stone tablets. The surface of the monument is uneven. There were still some teeth and bones left inside. One of the statues was wearing the necklace Kageo had given Yuko, and Kageo broke down in tears at the sight. Just then, the killer Myunkin entered through the door. Kageo, furious, lunged at him like a madman, but Myunkin knocked him to the ground with a single punch. Kageo screamed in rage, asking why he killed Yuko. Myunkin calmly replied, "Because she refused to call me daddy, so I made her into wall art." Kageo completely broke down. He clung to Myunkin's leg, refusing to let go no matter how brutally he was beaten. Finally, the police arrived just in time. Akechi knocked Myunkin to the ground with a few punches. Officer Kagami personally handcuffed Myunkin, but the case wasn't over yet. Myunkin had previously been arrested for harming young girls, but he was released after being declared mentally unfit. And this time was no different. The very next day, Myunkin was released again under the same reason. Scum like him never feel any remorse. He was already looking for his next victim, but this time his luck was over, because he will be finished by a more psychotic murderer. What kind of hatred could drive someone to sever another person's limbs, gouge out his eyes, deafen his ears, seal his mouth and nose, and keep him alive through constant injections, just to ensure he suffered endlessly? But what's even more shocking is that the one behind all of this was Kagami. What could have happened to make this righteous police officer turn into someone who would inflict such brutal torment? After losing both parents, Kagami juggled college and part-time jobs, living a modest life with his sister Takiko. The two relied on each other for everything. Though they had little, their days were filled with warmth and quiet hope. Takiko was incredibly hardworking. She never went out to play. She studied and worked on her designs late into the night. Kagami worked tirelessly to improve their lives and help his sister achieve her dreams. Takiko always told him not to work himself to death, that he should take time to relax. Her thoughtfulness only made Kagami more determined to take on the responsibility. On his first day as a police officer, Kagami was filled with hope for the future. He swore to protect the people as a man of the law. There were new cases every day, mountains of paperwork. The job was exhausting, but fulfilling, because he felt the value in protecting others. And most importantly, His sister was always there supporting him. He held fast to his beliefs and his duty as an officer until the day a murderer was released with no charges. That was when his faith began to crack. The killer was declared mentally ill and deemed unfit for criminal responsibility. His only punishment was to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital, but just a few months later, he was discharged and killed again. And as Kagami continued his career, he encountered more and more similar cases. From then on, he began to question the meaning of his work. Around this time, a masked figure calling himself 20 Faces appeared online. He claimed to be an agent of justice, delivering vigilante punishments to criminals while ignoring the law. 20 Faces' actions struck a chord in Kagami's heart. Maybe a part of him wanted to become that kind of person, but as a police officer, he still chose to believe in the righteousness of his job. As time went on, Kagami was promoted. The criminals he dealt with became more dangerous. One day, Kagami arrested a murderer named Sunaga, but Sunaga showed no remorse. He even arrogantly told Kagami that he was a psychiatric patient. His smugness infuriated Kagami, but bound by his duty as a cop, Kagami couldn't lay a hand on him. The same thing had happened with Myankin, a killer who tortured several girls, but walked free by claiming mental illness. Gradually, Kagami began to glimpse the darkness in his own soul, but every time he saw his sister, he forced himself to keep that darkness suppressed. A few days later, Kagami bought a cake for Takiko. On his way home, he got an urgent call from his colleagues. The already arrested Sunaga had killed a nurse at the hospital and escaped. He had even sent a threat to the police station, vowing to take revenge on Kagami's family. Kagami rushed home, but Takiko had disappeared. Not long after, the police found her corpse. Takiko's limbs had been cut off, her organs removed. She was hung on a rooftop, made into a grotesque wind charm. Looking at his once bright and lively sister, now slaughtered so cruelly, Kagami's inner darkness completely devoured his sanity. He began to question the law, question his role as a police officer. After that day, he became 20 Faces. He carried out what he called justice day and night. Kagami knew he would eventually be caught, but before that happened, he wanted to punish as many criminals as possible. Since 20 Faces existed to strike fear into evil, Kagami would announce the crimes and punishments online beforehand. The police decided to use that against him. They released Myankin, the murderer, as bait. They were sure that even if 20 Faces knew it was a trap, he would still come to punish Myankin, because if 20 Faces delayed in punishing the criminals, leading to further crimes, then the villains would no longer fear 20 Faces. Sure enough, 20 Faces showed up. Myankin was lured into a narrow alley. When he woke up, he found himself strapped to a meat grinder. Kagami appeared wearing the mask. He was ready to carry out the final judgment on Myankin, but just as Myankin was about to be ground alive, Akechi suddenly cut the power. It turned out everything had been Akechi's plan. Kagami pulled out a gun and aimed it at his former friend, but he couldn't pull the trigger. In the end, Kagami was arrested for murder. His colleagues watched as one of the finest officers they'd known was now a criminal. They felt a deep sense of regret, but none of them could truly understand Kagami's pain. The man who murdered his sister had already been tortured to death by Kagami. That night, after Myankin had been released, he was once again on the prowl for his next victim, but a man appeared, stabbing a knife into his chest. The man wore a 20 Faces mask. He carried out the final judgment on Myankin. From that day on, more and more people began donning masks, and became new versions of 20 Faces. Deep within a remote island, there stood a luxurious mansion. It was filled with giant nude female mannequins. This place was known as the ultimate paradise of male fantasy and art. But just a few days ago, a murder occurred. 2 men were crushed to death by the mannequins. At first, it was considered an accident, but then the police received a challenge letter from someone calling themselves 20 Faces. He claimed it was his judgment on evildoers. To crack the case, Akechi went to the prison to visit a woman known as Black Lizard. She was once a queen of the underworld, though now locked behind bars. She seemed to know everything, and she was infatuated with Akechi. She revealed that the island was built by a powerful tycoon named Furuta, and Furuta was absolute scum. He forced his employees to work 20 hours a day, brainwashed them with drugs, and caused numerous deaths from overwork and suicide. After leaving the prison, Akechi immediately headed to the island. He spoke with local police and relevant personnel. The victims were Furuta, chairman of the Furuta Corporation, and Kenkai, the mansion's architect. Both were killed at 4 a.m. by falling mannequins. All suspects had solid alibis. If it wasn't 20 faces, the case would have been ruled an accident. At that moment, a gear on the ground caught Akechi's attention. Inside the main hall, there was a massive mechanical structure. Once activated, pillars would rotate. Staff insisted the design was flawless and the materials top quality. That's when a procurement officer named Chiyoko drew Akechi's interest. A police investigation found that Chiyoko had deliberately selected substandard steel during material purchases. Akechi immediately saw through everything. Using her knowledge of math and mechanical engineering, Chiyoko had precisely calculated when the structure would collapse. At that moment, Kobayashi also made a shocking discovery. All the female mannequins in the hall were modeled after Chiyoko herself. Chiyoko then confessed the entire truth. Months ago, one of Chiyoko's close friends died from overwork. The company offered no compensation, no apology. She sought justice, but Furuta and Kenkai demanded her body in return. Chiyoko gave in. She thought she could use that to improve working conditions for the staff. But instead, the company doubled down on their abuse to mass-produce beautiful mannequins. And shockingly, every single nude mannequin was made in her likeness. Chiyoko finally broke down. So she put on a mask and became 20 faces, and secretly executed these two scumbags.